Justina, the enslaved woman who dismembered the master and his 5 children on Christmas night. Have you ever imagined waking up in the middle of Christmas night and instead of bells and laughter, seeing the sky lit up by flames consuming an entire manor house? The smell of burning flesh, muffled screams, and the dull sound of an axe striking hard. This is not a horror scene, but the bloody memory that marked a region of Brazil in 1874. At its center was Justina, an enslaved woman who, after years of abuse and loss, turned the holiest night of the year into vengeance. Raised among slave quarters and sugar mills, she knew how to heal lives. But that night, she chose to take those that represented centuries of oppression. This is not just a story of blood, but of resistance, a cry against slavery that echoed for generations. Today, you will learn every step that led Justina to etch her name into history. But first, I want to know, do you think someone can be driven to such an extreme? Comment and subscribe, because your voice keeps alive a memory the world tried to erase. 19th century Brazil was a country built on invisible chains. For every kilometer of sugarcane fields in Bahia's Recôncavo region, there were stories of pain carved into the ground, the barns, and the stone walls of the big houses. There, the sugar that sweetened European tables was produced at the cost of an implacable structure where the plantation owners ruled with absolute power. These families lived in luxurious mansions surrounded by imported furniture, silverware, and wine-filled banquets. While just meters away, dozens of people slept huddled on cold floors in slave quarters, with open wounds on their backs and hope fading day by day. Slavery was not just a social condition, it was a slow death sentence, sustained by a system that treated human beings as commodities. Children were torn from their mothers and sold as if they were objects. Young men were branded with hot irons so they would never forget to whom they belonged. Women were systematically violated, and their pain was silenced by fear and force. Christmas, which should symbolize peace and renewal, was celebrated with pomp by white families, while the enslaved were forced to work double to prepare banquets, clean halls, and dress the children of their oppressors. The music that echoed through the manor's corridors masked the moans coming from the slave quarters. The contrast between abundance and misery was so brutal. It seemed impossible for them to exist in the same space. Chimneys exhaled aromas of roasts and sweets, while the smell of sweat and blood clung to the air around the slave quarters. At that time, Bahia's Recôncavo region was considered the heart of the empire, but its rhythm beat to the sound of dragged shackles and orders shouted by overseers. To maintain control, the masters relied on punishments that went far beyond physical violence. Public humiliation was a constant weapon. It was common to see slaves tied to whipping posts, exposed under the sun, being flogged in front of everyone so that no one dared rebel. Every lash was more than pain. It was a lesson in submission. Escape attempts were punished with death or permanent mutilations, leaving scars that served as warnings to others. And yet, the flame of resistance never went out. In the eyes of many enslaved people, there was a silent strength, a courage that showed itself in quick glances, whispers in the night, and secret rituals in the forests, where African beliefs kept alive the roots of a people who refused to be erased. This was the world Justina grew up in. Each day was a battle for survival. Every decision made by the plantation masters directly affected dozens of lives. She learned early to move cautiously, observe details, and understand the mindset of those who believed they owned everything. While growing up in this environment of injustice, she also absorbed knowledge passed down through generations. The use of herbs, the secrets of healing, and stories that spoke of freedom and courage. Slowly, the girl marked by pain became a woman with a clear vision of the system that surrounded her. A system sustained by fear and violence, but one that was starting to show cracks. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because to understand the decision that turned Justina into a legend, we must look at the backstage of that society, where appearances of civility hid a harsh truth of extreme cruelty and absolute control. This is a journey of revelations that will show how one single night was capable of changing the history of an entire region. I want to know who felt their heart race with this story. Write in the comments right now. I feel history alive, and let's show that these silenced voices will never be erased. Justina was not born to be a feared legend. Before her name became synonymous with courage and revenge, she was just a woman carrying the weight of an entire lifetime of loss. She knew the scent of the forests, the power of roots and leaves, and the healing that came from nature. She learned from her mother, as a child, the art of being a midwife, a skill that made her indispensable. When cries of pain echoed through the night, whether from a white lady about to give birth or a young enslaved woman delivering a child who would be born without freedom, it was Justina who entered the room with a lamp in hand and a steady gaze, bringing hope. She had hands that saved lives, both of those who saw her as property and of those who shared her chains. But behind that calm woman was a wound that grew in silence. Justina's story cannot be told without mentioning the blood she cried silently. As a teenager, she saw her mother collapse in the sugarcane fields, exhausted from cutting cane under the scorching sun, carried back to the slave quarters as if she were just another broken tool. She lost younger siblings, sold to distant plantations, never knowing where they went. She herself was victimized by the master's sons, who took her as an object, leaving scars not only on her body but also on her soul. One of these assaults resulted in a pregnancy that ended with the baby's death, with no chance of help. Her second child, a boy who could barely walk, was beaten to death by an overseer for stopping to drink water. Justina buried him with her own hands in a shallow grave behind the slave quarters. From that day on, a silent flame began to burn inside her. Despite it all, she maintained a posture that earned her a certain respect. Her wisdom made her essential to everyone on the plantation. She knew how to treat fevers, heal lash wounds, and even make remedies that impressed the masters, who boasted about having a valuable healer. This position gave her something rare: freedom to move through the manor, observe conversations, notice details, and understand the family's habits. Justina saw everything. She witnessed the extravagance of Christmas feasts, the laughter around abundant tables, while just a few meters away, men and women bled in the slave quarters. Each banquet was an affront, each laugh a reminder that the lives of those who worked the land were worth less than spilled wine on the floor. Over time, the tearful girl who walked fearfully through the corridors became a woman with a firm gaze and a strategic mind. Justina came to understand the power structure sustaining the plantations, a system built on fear, violence, and total control. But she also knew that every empire has cracks. Her knowledge of every corner of the property, every hidden path, and every weakness of the masters was no longer just a survival tool. It was a weapon in the making. Before being called a murderer or a heroine, Justina was a mother who had everything ripped away. A woman who buried her dreams alongside her children and saw the hope of a better life crushed by those who once trusted her hands to bring new lives into the world. This duality, to heal and harm, to save and destroy, shaped the woman who would become a symbol. She wasn't seeking glory or formal justice. She wanted to return to the world a fraction of the pain it had given her. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because to know Justina is to understand how a woman invisible to the powerful managed to see what they couldn't. That fear could change sides. Right now, Justina lives. Let's turn the comments into a living memorial for all our brothers and sisters who once suffered brutality at the hands of their masters. The sun had already set when Justina heard the first scream. The sound echoed through the plantation yard, slicing through the heavy silence of the hot night. She ran barefoot across the ground, her heart racing, feeling the rough earth scrape her feet. She found her son, a boy of only 8, lying beside the well. His small body was covered in blood, and next to him, the overseer held a whip, still stained, breathing heavily as if punishing a child was a victory. "Learn not to steal water," he growled, before spitting on the ground and walking away. Justina fell to her knees, her fingers trembling as she tried to stop the blood flowing from the boy's head. "Talk to me, my son," she whispered, but the child's eyes were already lifeless. The smell of iron in the air, mixed with sweat and dust, clung to her skin as a reminder that would never leave. That night, not only did her son die, the woman Justina had been also died. She didn't cry out loud. There were no screams or outbursts of despair, only a sepulchral silence as she cradled the boy's body, rocking him as if she could bring him back to life. The moon lit up the yard and made every detail even crueler. The pool of blood spreading over the packed dirt, the whip marks on such young flesh, the vacant stare of the child she had carried in her womb with so much love. Justina dug a shallow grave behind the slave quarters with her own hands because she knew no one would help her. With every handful of dirt she threw, with every heavy breath, something inside her shifted. The heart that had been wounded so many times now turned to stone. Kneeling on the damp earth, Justina was no longer just a respected midwife. In that moment she began to become a shadow the masters would never expect to face. Her son's death was not an isolated episode, but the culmination of years of abuse she carried in silence. A few months earlier, she had been the victim of a collective assault, attacked by the master's sons during a party. They laughed as they hurt her, as if her pain was a form of entertainment. Justina endured it all in silence, but her gaze was never the same again. The whips that tore her skin, the insults, the humiliation of being treated as nothing, all of it built a wall of hatred so solid that no one could see. In that scarred body was an awakened mind, observing every detail of the plantation, every movement of the overseers, every weakness of the men who thought they owned everything. Over time, she stopped merely reacting. She began to plan. Each visit to the manor to treat wounds of drunken masters was an opportunity to study the terrain. Every night she helped a lady give birth was also a moment to overhear conversations, notice schedules, memorize escape routes. Justina learned to use the trust given to her as a weapon. This transformation was slow, almost imperceptible. Other enslaved people still saw her as the wise woman who cared for everyone, but inside she carried an unbreakable decision. She would not die without seeing justice. While the plantation carried on with its routine of parties, lavish dinners, and normalized violence, Justina became someone even she didn't recognize in the mirror. The once gentle look was now cold. The hands that saved lives trembled at night, not with fear, but with anticipation of the day they would do the opposite. This was the new Justina, no longer just a healer, but a woman shaped by pain in silence, carrying a hidden truth no one dared imagine. When the masters looked at her, they saw only an obedient servant. Little did they know they were feeding her fury with every order, every life destroyed. This journey was not made only of losses, but of revelations. Justina began to understand the true impact of every decision made by the masters, how their wealth and parties were sustained by the blood of innocents. This realization fed something even greater than hatred, a sense of mission. She didn't just want revenge, she wanted every tear shed to be avenged with the same intensity. The image of her son's body by the well never left her mind. It was that memory that accompanied her every morning, reminding her that the time of submission was ending. Can you imagine living in such a cruel and unjust time? Hit like now to show that these stories must be remembered and never forgotten. The master of the plantation Antonio de Souza Brandão was a man whose very presence silenced the slave quarters. Tall, burly, with a thick beard and cold eyes, he carried himself like a king in his private territory. The plantation was his empire, and he made sure to remind everyone of that every day. Known for wearing leather boots polished to a shine, Antonio often stepped on the faces of fallen slaves as if they were less than nothing. His deep voice echoed through the halls, barking orders that were always followed by violence. On Sundays, when there was supposed to be rest, he turned the yard into a stage for public punishments, tying men to the whipping post while guests laughed and drank wine. He believed fear was the best way to rule, and the hatred he felt toward the enslaved seemed to feed him. His 5 sons were distorted reflections of his cruelty, each one with a personality that made the plantation a true hell. The eldest, Lorenzo, was 25 and had inherited not only his father's physique, but also his arrogance. Always dressed in expensive clothes, he carried a whip wrapped around his arm like a luxury accessory. Lorenzo loved to humiliate, especially women, and used it as a way to demonstrate power. He was the one who organized exemplary punishments, inventing creative tortures like making slaves carry heavy stones under the sun until they fainted. His joy was in seeing who could last the longest without collapsing. The second son, Arthur, 23, was even more perverse, but with a silent cruelty. Unlike Lorenzo, he didn't yell or threaten. He observed, calculated, and then attacked without warning. He liked to play with his victims before hurting them, creating psychological terror that made many tremble just at the sight of him. He was known for branding slaves with hot irons, creating property marks he designed himself. He smiled while doing it, as if it were a work of art. Gaspar, the third, 21, had an explosive personality. He was impulsive, uncontrollable, and any slip-up became a reason for violence. Many said Gaspar was aroused by others' pain. He liked to watch punishments until the end and laughed loudly at the suffering. If a slave cried, he ordered even more lashes. He was often seen walking around the property with a bottle of cachaça in hand, always ready to unleash his rage on whoever was near. Miguel, 19, had inherited the malice and manipulation of his grandfather. He didn't need to raise a hand to cause harm. His weapon was his tongue. He poisoned his father's mind against anyone, fabricated stories about the enslaved to provoke punishments, and enjoyed watching the chaos he created. Many feared Miguel more than his older brothers, because no one ever knew when he was plotting something. And then there was the youngest, Bento, only 17, but already with the cold look of someone who learned early that power came from blood. He tried to imitate his brothers in everything, but his pleasure was in killing animals in front of the children in the slave quarters to teach them a lesson. It was his way of showing that there was no mercy in the Brando family. These 5 young men were extensions of their father. They grew up watching violence being normalized, learning that cruelty was synonymous with respect. At manor parties, they competed to see who imposed the most creative punishment, who made the victim scream the loudest. The plantation was a theater of horrors, and the Brando family ruled over it without remorse. Every lash, every humiliation, every tear shed by the enslaved created an atmosphere of terror that spread across the Reconcavo. And in the midst of it all, Justina watched. She saw every detail, felt every injustice as if it were a wound cut into her own flesh. The presence of this family awakened in Justina a strength even she didn't know she had. There was no night when she didn't hear the cries of someone being punished. The air of the plantation smelled of molasses, sweat, and blood, and every dawn seemed to herald another destroyed life. That family was feared but also hated. The people of the region whispered stories about them, and many believed the Brandos were cursed, a curse Justina would one day confirm. Close your eyes for 5 seconds and imagine living this. Now write in the comments the first word that comes to your mind. Justina no longer walked through the plantation as a simple servant. Her eyes scanned every corner with precision, as if memorizing an invisible map. She knew the master's schedules, when each one went out hunting, when the older brothers drank until they fell, when the patriarch closed the library doors to count the money earned from the labor of hundreds of lives. She watched in silence, disguising her attention under the weight of a headscarf and a submissive posture. While everyone saw only a tired woman, she was building something much bigger, a plan impossible to detect. The manor's corridors became her allies. Justina knew where each floorboard creaked, which door had no lock, where the masters kept keys and weapons. Her visits to the dining room, the kitchen, and the family's bedrooms were in fact part of a meticulous investigation. Even the sound of wind passing through the tall windows at night began to make sense to her. She knew the overseer's footsteps, the guards' shift changes, the shortest path to reach the kitchen without being seen. A lifetime of submission gave her what no master ever imagined, a strategic advantage that only those who live in the shadows can have. Over time, she began to choose whom she could trust, and that choice was as delicate as it was deadly. One wrong look, a word at the wrong moment, and they would all be condemned. Her first accomplice was Joachim, an enslaved man from the mill, with broad arms and whip marks covering his back. He had lost 2 children in a single day, killed by order of Lorenzo, the eldest son. The silent hatred in his gaze was the same that Justina carried. Then came Mariana, an older woman who worked in the kitchen and had daily access to the master's pots. Mariana knew how to prepare poisons, mix roots, and make any man sleep deeply without ever noticing. The third accomplice was Elias, a quiet young man who spent his days fixing tools and gates. His skill with metal would be fundamental. Finally, she found strength in Rosa, a young woman who carried the pain of having been violated by the 5 brothers, and who, even wounded, had the courage to fight. These 4 names formed a silent circle of resistance. Meetings took place in unlikely places, behind the chicken coop, on a slope far from the manor's view, or on nights when the moon was hidden and the darkness covered the sugarcane fields. Justina did not speak much. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything. The plan began to take shape, but she knew that physical strength would not be enough. Spiritual protection was also necessary. Justina began to draw on her mother's memories, who had come from Angola, and the rituals she had learned as a child. She started preparing amulets with seeds, colorful beads, chicken blood, and prayers whispered in Kimbundu. Each of her accomplices received a mark made with charcoal on the chest, an African symbol of protection. In the slave quarters, Justina dug a small hole where she buried animal bones, sacred roots, and objects stolen from the manor, an offering to the ancestors. May they see our pain and bring justice by our hands, she murmured in her mother's language. The atmosphere on the plantation seemed to change day by day. The masters still held their parties, drank and laughed loudly, but Justina saw signs no one else noticed. Candles that went out on their own, dogs howling at night, the smell of burned herbs lingering in the air. The tension was invisible but real. It was as if the very ancestors were walking among them, preparing the ground for something no one dared to name. Every detail was carefully calculated. The escape route was marked. The improvised weapons were hidden. Mariana prepared the wine that would make the masters drowsy, while Elias reinforced the doors so no one could escape when it all began. Justina knew she would not have a second chance. Either she killed them all, or she would be killed. There was no room for regret. She slept little. Always with one hand on the handle of the axe, she hid under the straw bed. The chosen day was near, and while the rest of the plantation carried on with its routine of laughter and screams, she carried a secret so heavy it seemed to change even the way she walked. If you felt the weight of this preparation, comment now. I feel the tension in the air. Let's turn the comments into a reflection of Justina's courage. On that Christmas night, the manor house looked like an illuminated palace. The windows gleamed with the reflection of oil lamps. The table was covered with Portuguese wine, fresh fruits, and roasted meats. Music echoed through the wide walls. Loud laughter filled the air, heavy with heat and perfume. Glasses clinked in the hands of the masters, who toasted without imagining these would be their last hours. Lorenzo spoke loudly, telling hunting stories while gesturing with a glass in his hand. Gaspar laughed scandalously, already drunk, spilling wine on the floor without caring. Bento provoked his brothers, throwing chicken bones over the white linen tablecloth. The party was a display of power, a show of wealth built on blood and sweat. But outside, the slave quarters were plunged into silence. Not even the crickets dared to sing. The air seemed too heavy, as if the ancestors walked through the sugarcane fields watching. The enslaved knew something was about to happen, but no one dared to speak. Some held their children tightly, others prayed softly in ancient tongues, asking for protection. The wind carried the smell of the manor house feast mixed with that of fear. And, in the midst of that silence, Justina stood up. Dressed simply with a headscarf tied, she walked toward the kitchen. The axe was hidden under her cloak, but her presence was so strong it seemed to radiate an invisible weight. Mariana stood at the door, holding a lamp. A single look was enough. Without a word, she extinguished the flame, plunging the corridor into darkness. Elias locked the doors one by one, closing off any escape route. Joaquim positioned himself near the main entrance, holding a heavy chain. Rosa, her face covered by a scarf, watched over the hall. Everything was perfectly orchestrated. The air was dense. When Justina entered the manor house, the festive atmosphere seemed to lose its shine. Her steps were light but loaded with purpose. The laughter continued, but there was something strange in the air, as if a shadow had crossed the hall. She stopped at the door, raised the axe. The brothers did not understand at first. The sound of the first blow was dull, cutting, echoing through the whole hall. The blade struck Lorenzo on the side of the neck. The wine fell from the glass and mixed with the blood, creating a crimson stain on the white tablecloth. He fell without a scream. Silence took over. Gaspar tried to react, pulling a knife from the table. Justina did not hesitate. She advanced with firm steps, the axe descending once more. The blade struck his shoulder, breaking bones. His scream echoed, but was soon silenced by a second blow, this time to the head. Blood splattered on the walls, running down the expensive rugs. The table flipped, plates shattered, and panic began. Arthur ran toward the door, but Joaquim was already there. With a shove, the man was thrown back into the center of the room. Justina advanced without haste, like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Arthur tried to defend himself, but it was useless. The axe came down hard, hitting his ribs. He screamed, fell to his knees, begged for forgiveness. Justina did not respond. The next blow ended his plea. Miguel, the manipulator, was paralyzed. His eyes were wide, his hands trembling. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Justina walked slowly toward him, her feet steady on the wooden floor covered in blood. Miguel backed away, stumbling over a chair. I didn't, he stammered. She silenced him with a single motion. The axe came down diagonally, cutting through shoulder and chest. Miguel fell lifeless, his body limp like an empty sack. Bento, the youngest, tried to flee through the back. He ran through the dark corridors, knocking over furniture along the way, but Rosa was lying in wait. With a yank, she grabbed his arm and threw him to the floor. Bento screamed, thrashed, tried to bite. Justina arrived right behind and with a firm look raised the axe. It's over. The sound of the final blow echoed, dry, definitive. One by one, the dynasty fell. The manor house hall was unrecognizable. Bodies were scattered, blood pooling and running across the wooden floor. The Christmas feast was mixed with shards of glass and pieces of flesh. The music had stopped. Laughter had been replaced by absolute silence. Justina stood at the center, covered in blood, but with a calm gaze. There was no remorse, there was no fear, only the certainty that that night would be remembered forever. But what happened next turned this story into a legend that would echo for generations, laden with symbolism and fear. Write in the comments, I felt this scene. If this story is holding your attention and you want to discover more hidden truths from our past, subscribe to the channel now and turn on the bell so you never miss an episode here. The Manor House Hall had become a macabre scene of ancestral justice. Justina, covered in blood, no longer seemed just a woman. There was in her an almost supernatural presence, a force that came from far beyond that night. In silence, she began to drag the bodies of the masters and the 5 sons, positioning them carefully in the center of the hall. Each was placed symbolically. Lorenzo, the cruel patriarch, had his head raised and placed on the wine-stained table, while the sons were arranged around him, forming a circle as if at a final judgment. The blood, still warm, ran across the wooden floor, creating trails that Justina used to draw African symbols she had learned from her mother. With bloodied fingers, she traced signs of protection, justice, and liberation on the walls and floor, turning that space into an altar. She took a deep breath, picked up a lamp, and let oil fall over the bodies and furniture. A struck match broke the silence. The small flame seemed too fragile for that heavy environment, but a mere breath was enough for the fire to gain strength. In seconds, heavy velvet curtains turned into torches, the old wood hissed under the heat, and the manor house began to burn. The reflection of the flames danced on Justina's face, lighting her steady, impenetrable eyes. The woman, who for years had been seen as a servant, now looked like an entity. Outside, the first crackles of burning wood woke a few enslaved people. The slave quarters, where silence was law, were taken over by the sound of frightened whispers. Men and women rose, confused with wide eyes, smelling smoke. Children cried softly, not understanding what was happening. That's when the door opened and Justina entered. The bloodied axe in her hand gleamed under the orange light coming from the fire. She didn't need to say much. A simple, "It's over," was enough. Fear gave way to hope. For the first time, those people saw that the untouchables had fallen. Rosa ran to the smaller cells and began to loosen the chains. Joachim led the men outside, while Elias helped the women with the small children. The smoke grew, lighting the sky with shades of orange and red, as if it were daytime. The former slaves gathered outside, staring in disbelief at the manor house burning like a giant bonfire. Justina walked. Ahead, the axe raised. Her image, with marked skin, torn clothes, and splashes of blood, looked like a living banner. The crowd, once marked by the silence of submission, began to murmur prayers, songs in African tongues, cries for liberation. That group of more than 200 people began to march. With each step, they left behind years of torture. The plantation dogs, which had always frightened them, were cowering, barking at the darkness. The path to the woods was lit only by the flames, consuming the Brando family's ultimate symbol of power. That fire was not just destruction, it was materialized liberation. The smoke rose high in the sky, visible for miles, like a warning to the entire region. When the sun rose, the plantation was nothing but ashes. The news spread quickly. Fishermen passing along the Paraguasu River saw the smoke and ran to tell nearby villages. Within hours, the rumor already had a name. The black woman, Justina, killed the masters. In neighboring plantations, landowners locked their doors and stored their weapons, terrified at the idea that their own slave quarters might take inspiration. In some houses, white women cried in fear, sending desperate letters to relatives in Salvador. In the slave quarters of other farms, the effect was the opposite. Enslaved people who until then had no hope began to smile. Chained men pounded their fists on the ground, quietly repeating Justina's name as if it were a prayer. Elders told stories, saying that woman was not just flesh and bone, but a spirit sent by the Orixas to bring justice. Soon, she was no longer just a fugitive. She had become a living legend, a shadow the masters feared and the enslaved revered. Justina walked at the front of the group, the axe on her shoulder, without looking back. The transformation was complete. The woman who had already saved lives, who knew the touch of pain and the cruelty of the lash, now walked with an unsettling calm, leading everyone into the unknown. But for them, it didn't matter where they were going. What mattered was that they were free. Each step echoed as an act of resistance. And on that Christmas morning, the Reconcavo woke up different. Power had changed sides. Comment: I see the fire of freedom. I want to know who feels the strength of this story as much as I do. The hunt for Justina began weeks after the massacre that set the Reconcavo ablaze. Troops were sent from Salvador, accompanied by tracking dogs and vengeful overseers, all determined to capture her alive to make an example of her. But Justina seemed like a ghost. She appeared and disappeared in the forests, attacked plantations, freed slaves, and left only traces of fire and fear. To the masters, she was a demon. To the captives, a warrior saint. With each passing night, the legend grew. Some said she did not sleep, that her axe never lost its edge, and that the Oryxars protected her with an invisible cloak. Months passed, until one dawn, surrounded by more than 50 soldiers, Justina made her final choice. She did not surrender. She fought like someone who had nothing to lose. The sound of gunshots echoed through the mountains, but witnesses swear the soldiers backed away as if facing a greater force. When the smoke cleared, they did not find her body, only blood marks on the ground and the axe buried in a tree, like a signature. Some believe she died that night. Others say she vanished into the sacred forests and was taken by the spirits of her ancestors. For many, Justina did not die. She became something greater, an eternal symbol. To this day, among the ruins of the burned plantation, locals say they hear heavy footsteps on Christmas night. The wind that passes through the glassless windows carries the sound of an axe striking the ground. There are those who swear they have seen a black woman with shining eyes walking among the ruins. Local florists say that every year, fresh flowers mysteriously appear on the stones that remain of the manor house. Candles, cachaça, red ribbons, and even machetes are left by people who ask for protection and strength. Justina became a spirit of vengeance and justice that echoes in every story of resistance, reminding us that freedom always exacts a price. This is not just the story of an enslaved woman. It is proof that silence can turn into a scream, that fear can transform into courage, and that no chain is strong enough to silence a heart determined to be free. Justina lives in circle songs, in chanted points, in the low conversations that cross generations. For the oppressors, she is a warning. For the descendants of slaves, a beacon. Her story crosses time because it carries something greater than violence. It carries memory, dignity, and a strength that no official history has managed to erase. With every injustice that happens, in every woman who fights, in every man who refuses to bend, Justina is reborn. The axe she carried became a symbol, and the flame that set that plantation on fire never went out. Today, Brazil, which tries to hide its scars, still feels the echo of her steps. And perhaps that's why her legend bothers so much, because it reminds us that freedom was not gifted, it was conquered with blood and courage. This is not just a legend, it is an open wound in the history of Brazil and so many other countries that needs to be remembered so that it never happens again. If this story moved you, whether with anger, admiration, or pain, leave a like and check out the video I prepared for you here on the end screen, even more shocking and touching than this one.